Hello, so today's video is all about the Canon 5D Mark II, in particular the settings that I use on this camera. A lot of people asked me to make this video, and so I would suggest if you don't have a particular interest in the 5D Mark II, probably best not to watch because it's all going to be about the Mark II. So this isn't my main camera anymore. I shoot with the Canon R5 and 5D Mark IV these days, which I think are the right tools for the job for me right now. But that by no means means that I think that this thing is not still a great camera, because it is. It has a great sensor. The colour from this is brilliant, and it's really rather simple in terms of its operation, which is a really good thing. It comes from an era where things were just a little bit more simple in life, more straightforward. Pre-COVID. I mean, this thing's been knocking around for 15 years or something like that, and I shot hundreds, probably thousands of assignments with it all over the world, all kinds of different things. And just picking it up today just kind of took me on a journey of nostalgia, thinking about a pre-COVID world where everything was a little bit simpler and more kind of less complicated, and made me kind of think of some of the experiences that I had with this while I was away on assignment shooting. And picking it up feels like, you know, putting on a pair of comfortable old slippers, because it's just so simple. And, you know, coming from the R5, which is a complicated beast to say the least, the thing just feels lovely. You've just got kind of everything that you need is just right here in front of you. I've still got the Canon strap on it, original Canon strap, and God knows how many thousands of clicks this thing's got on it, and you know, it's got some mileage, that's for sure, and the strap is really showing signs of age. It's kind of literally hanging by a thread. I've got the booster on the bottom, which is you know, sometimes I had this on, sometimes I took it off, but the battery grip from Canon is great. I've not used any of the other generic ones with this particular camera. I've always found the Canon grips to be a bit more expensive but worth the extra money, sort of super reliable, and it gives you the extra upright shutter button, as well as being able to pack 2 batteries in if you need them. But this thing's always been quite good on battery life, so that's not really essential by any means. Quite handy if you're shooting with big lenses. I've got big hands as well, so the grip really kind of does help. I think the best thing that I can do is to dive into the menu system and just talk you through some of my settings and explain to you, you know, quickly what they do and why I set them. So here we go. So pretty much before any shoot, and pretty much irrespective of what camera I'm using, I'll always try and just spend a few seconds just to get the camera back to a kind of starting point where I can feel comfortable with the settings, just in case I've had something a bit odd dialed in on the previous shoot. I don't want to be tripped over by that. So to begin with, I always make sure that I've got a clean memory card in the camera. Now, you have to be doubly cautious with that you don't want to be deleting or formatting any pictures that you haven't backed up to your computer. But you know, I have a workflow in place for that. So typically I will start by doing a format on my memory card. Some people do that, some people don't. It's just the way that I've always worked, and I've had very few failures by working in this way. And when I say few failures, I mean I've probably had 10 failures in 25 years or something like that of digital work in terms of memory cards failing on me. Now, so this thing on the left hand side here is a exposure dial. You tell it what exposure mode you want to put the camera in. And there's a bunch of different options. There's some custom functions, and then you've got a bunch of different options. Most of the time I use manual. That means I put the settings in myself. Sometimes I use AV, which is aperture value, or aperture priority if you like. Occasionally I'll use B, which means that the B will hold the shutter open for as long as you keep the shutter button pressed down for long exposures. And sometimes I'll use TV. TV means time value or shutter priority, which means you set the shutter speed and the camera will do the rest. Should mention AV means you set the aperture that you want and the camera will do the rest. But for the sake of today's video, we'll set it to manual. We've also got a couple of auto modes down there, which are quite useful. So to begin with, what exposure settings do I begin with? Well, 125th of a second at f5.6 at 400 ISO seems to be a good starting point for me. That won't be the settings that I do for every shoot. It's just how I begin, and then I adjust accordingly depending on what it is that I'm shooting. So you adjust the shutter speed using this lovely big dial here by your finger, 125th at 5.6, and then you adjust your aperture with this lovely ring down here on the back. We'll make sure that's back to 5.6. Okay, So ISO 400 is always a good place to start. We'll come on to that in a second. Now up here on the top plate, you have these 4 buttons. This little one just is a light that illuminates the panel here. Now, my one doesn't work because this camera is battered, right? Look at all the corrosion all over it. And at some point, some seawater or sand or something has got into that button and it doesn't work. These 3 do though, and I'm a big fan of all of them because it means that you get direct access to some of the most important settings on the camera. And some much newer, much more expensive cameras don't have such easy access as this. So we'll just talk through very quickly what they all do. So to begin with, you've got your ISO and your flash compensation button. And the easiest way I can show you that is by doing this. The flash exposure compensations means if you're using a speed light flash gun on the camera, you can dial in more light if you want or take some light out. Very useful if you're using flash, but we're not using a flash on this occasion. The ISO speed is the sensitivity of the sensor. I begin at 400. And with this camera, with the 5D Mark II, I'd probably go up to 1600 without too many problems. Beyond that, I think you're taking your life into your own hands with noisy pictures. But ultimately, everyone needs to find their own way with these things. You know, some people insist that you can't use these cameras beyond kind of, 160 ISO, because I think that is the native ISO of the sensor. And a lot of people get very irritated by the noise if you go beyond that. It's never been something that's been a particular problem for me. And like I say, I will shoot this camera up to probably 1600 ISO. Okay, next button along is our AF and our drive button. Now, this is very useful because it allows us to set the mode that we're going to use our focus in. One shot is very good for static subjects. AI focus is a kind of hybrid mix of focus methods. I don't personally use it. A lot of people really like it. And then servo mode is for moving stuff. So I use servo mode when I'm photographing anything that's action, and one shot when I'm shooting things that are static. I have evolved a little bit now with the R5, just jumping off subject ever so slightly, where I use AI servo a lot more. But for the purpose of this video, I spent most of my time in one shot. Now our drive mode down here, you have single shooting, that means it will take one picture. Continuous shooting, that means it will take as many pictures as is possible when you hold your finger on the button down. I think this camera does about 3 frames per second, something. It's not very fast, but it's an old boy, right? And then you have your self-timer mode. You have 10 seconds or 2 seconds, which are both very useful. If you want to get into the picture, you can use the 10-second mode with the camera on a tripod, and then it will take 10 seconds before it takes the picture. But 2 seconds is very useful if you're shooting a long exposure on a tripod, for example, because that means that you won't get camera shake. Next button across is this one, which if we come here, we've got our metering modes. So evaluative metering is what I typically start at. Then we have partial metering or spot metering or center weighted average. Now, the 2 that I use the most are spot metering if I'm trying to do something very specific. That means that the camera will, just meter from a very tiny area. Or evaluative metering for me is very good because that's just making the camera do the hard work for you, where it's looking at the whole scene and making a kind of educated guess at the exposure. So I use evaluative metering most of the time and then adjust accordingly if I need to adjust my exposure. Our white balance, you can flick through all of the different options here. This controls the kind of color of your image. I typically use auto white balance most of the time, in fact nearly all of the time. And that might come as a shock to some people, but I'm a big fan of shooting RAW, and you can adjust the color afterwards in RAW. Okay, so let's have a quick look through the menu. So to begin with, I always shoot in RAW, not really interested in shooting JPEG. The beep is the AF confirmation beep. I have that set to on, but you must be cautious of that because if you're shooting in a quiet environment, the beep can be ever so slightly distracting, for wedding photographers, etc. Shoot without card, I have that set to off because I don't want a chance of being able to take some pictures without having a memory card in the camera. And then review time, you can set the different options for that, but I have it set to hold. And that means when you take a picture, it will appear on the screen and stay on the screen until you press another button. Moving along, we have our exposure compensation. I always leave that to 0. White balance, that's just another way of inputting this information. I have that set to auto white balance. We'll just quickly move through the ones that don't have anything kind of that interesting. Color space, I shoot between both of these different color spaces depending on what I'm doing, but sRGB is always a kind of reasonable place to begin. This is all about playback. We don't have any information in there at all. My highlight alerts, I'm quite basic, so I disable all of this kind of stuff. So highlight alert, I have to disable. AF point display, I have to disable. Histogram, I have that set to brightness. Moving on, auto power off, I have that set to 15 minutes. Sometimes I might even put it to just no auto power off at all, because I want the camera just to be kind of present all the time. Everyone will have to find their own way with that kind of thing. Auto rotate, I have that set to on for in the camera and on the computer. It means that if you flip the camera that way up into portrait mode, it means it'll automatically flip the pictures for you. File numbering I have set to continuous. Moving on, I leave my LCD set to auto most of the time. Sometimes you will need to adjust that if you're in the studio, for example, or in some situation where the lighting is interesting, then you might want to put that onto manual. But that's just how you see the LCD on the back. And all the information here, date and time, and make sure that's accurate. Really important if you're shooting with more than one camera to have that information absolutely bang on, and I will sync the cameras side by side quite often before a big shoot, to make sure that I can then filter all of the pictures by time captured. Really helpful if you're shooting a multiple camera project. Moving on over here, there isn't so much here that I think would be of interest to you, but then we get into this mode, which is highly complex on this camera. And I'll be completely honest with you that it took me a long time to work a lot of this stuff out. And the most interesting thing in here is about the back button focus. And I will try and explain quickly what all of these things do. So the first custom function is exposure. And we go in here, and I haven't actually altered anything in this custom function 1. Everything is kind of as it is in terms of factory standard. Custom function 2, I have a couple of different things here. It's always really difficult to navigate through these things. So on 1, I have this shit's just set to off. And then on 2, I have the high ISO speed disabled, because again, I'm pretty basic. On 3, I have it disabled. And on 4, I have my auto lighting optimizer disabled. So I'm always kind of trying to get back to basics with these things, I guess. And then custom function 3. Now I have a few different things in here. So let's dash back to 1. I hope this isn't too confusing for you. I think it's confusing for anyone that's ever picked this camera up. 1, I have nothing set at all. 2, I have nothing set at all. On 3, I have my AF point selection method set to the multi-controller button here. I call it like the little joystick. And that means that I can move my AF point around using this, which is actually really rather useful. So, if I'm trying to find an AF focus point, and I want to raise it from the center of the frame up to the top to, let's say, get someone's eyes in focus, I can use this to do that. I have that set to on, which is standard. I have that set to enable. I have this one set to disable. This one set to disable. And then I have this AF micro adjustment is really cool in this camera, because you can calibrate individual lenses, so you can calibrate individual lenses all by the same amount. So I guess that's if you had a camera that was a bit out of whack, then you might want to do it all by the same amount. Personally, I've had the most success with calibrating lenses individually. Then we get on to custom function 4, which is where it all gets a little bit heavy duty and complicated. Hello, it's Roy from the future. I've just been editing the video and I just want to point out that what I'm talking about is just if you want your camera to be a back button focused enabled 5D Mark II. Not if you're just happy continuing to use the shutter button to do the autofocus, then that's cool. Don't worry about it. My settings are for setting the camera up for back button focus. Hope that helps. Onwards. Now, for the longest time, I'm a back button focuser, but for the longest time, I couldn't work out how to make this button here operate my back focus. This one did it, but then the shutter button did it as well, and it was complicated out of the factory. So for the longest time, I just used this camera against my better instincts with just the shutter button operating the autofocus because I couldn't work out how to do it. Now, the only thing that you need to pay attention to is 3, 1, 4 in this menu setting in custom function 4. And what that means is that this button here will activate your focus, and this button here will do everything else. It will adjust the exposure and lock the exposure in just before you take the picture with the shutter button. Now, everyone may find different ways of setting this camera up. I personally look at this and I just see white noise in terms of the different words and letters, but I've tried all the different options and this is how I eventually settled on setting the camera up to do what I needed it to do. You might be different, other people will prefer other things, but 3, 1, 4 in custom function 4 means that this button will activate your autofocus. Listen to that old lens rattling around. And then this button will take your picture if you wish it to. But it will also, this will not automatically lock the exposure. Now you may want to change that, and you can change that if you want to in custom function 4. You'll have to fiddle around with it and you will have to find your own way. But 3, 1, 4 is what I personally want. Is there anything else here? Okay, so the sort of my menu, which means you can customize different things as you want. I've got my format option in there. I've got my sensor cleaning. I've got my live view movie function set, which is this button up here, which enables you to get, because this camera will record 1080p at 25 frames per second, cinematic full frame footage. And then we won't go into the video side of things today. That's, you know, this is all about stills photography. AF point selection method, I have that as a sort of shortcut. Shutter button AF on, again, that's a sort of shortcut back to being able to turn the shutter button on in a more traditional way if you want. This is how I set up my Canon 5D Mark IV. I hope this video has been of some use to you. Please do subscribe if you like this kind of content. And thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.